Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Common Mansplaining. My name is Eddie. This is Christian. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. As you know, I've been having a little faith journey. And so, as a consequence, I've been looking at a lot of different faiths. I've also always been fascinated by ancient civilizations and ancient cultures. And so, one of this sort of led me to a ancient civilization and a storyline that I had never encountered before. So today we're going to discuss the Book of Mormon and the claims that it makes. Christian happens to be a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and so he's going to help guide me through this process as I analyze this. So this is going to be kind of a skeptic's point of view that we discuss. But before we get into it, guys, please hit like, please hit subscribe, turn your notifications on. I promise if you stick with us, we will earn your viewership, and let's get to it. So, Book of Mormon, huh?
Yeah. You're coming out, you're interested in ancient American civilizations. You never realized the connection.
That was one of the first things that amazed me was that, like I've recently been telling you about some of the civilizations that, the archaeological paradigm kind of neglects. But what was amazing to me is I hadn't even heard of this claim. Like the claim, there's a claim, and we'll go into it a little bit more, but there's a claim that basically there's this line of people that came from like the Middle East and Africa to South America. And then there was a civilization grew from that line and then, migrated up into North America, which, never had heard that. I mean, I knew that the classical narrative is that the Clovis Indian tribe came over the Bering Strait to North America and populated everything from there, right? And so the common assumption is that basically any cultures that are in South America, like the Aztecs, the Incans, the Mayans, all originated from that progression. Right. But I hadn't even heard that there was like an alternate, like kind of a diffusionist concept. So yeah, how did I miss that?
Well, obviously, the that's what's taught in schools,
Right.
and the Book of Mormon narrative isn't. They're not saying that they're the only people that populated, the only source of people that populated the Americas, and it's just a record. It's a record of sort of these tribes. It's really sort of a record of three migrations we can talk about, but that they don't explain all the migrations here, and so the ones that that don't lean on the Book of Mormon are more easily taught in school,
Right.
And so but everything that the Book of Mormon taught, as it was published in 1830, was very different. Was 100% different from what was known or taught conventionally about Native Americans at the time. And they would have any type of Middle Eastern Semitic connection.
Right.
Was there was no archaeological records to back that up. Right. And so it was a complete act of faith. That has changed as the archaeological, the curious Victorians and others have explored and learned more about the American indigenous peoples. Learned about and found records of Egyptians visiting, right? In Kentucky, they find under some of these limestone things, Egyptian hieroglyphs.
In Kentucky?
In Kentucky.
Holy
cow.
This
is a big thing. And that led to, this was in the late 90s, where to a Harvard author, Harvard archaeologist, writing a book called America BC, and his new theory was that Egyptians had come to America.
Whoa.
So they introduced it. And then more recently, Tucker Carlson had a thing where talking about how they discovered Phoenician writing. Right. Phoenicians were they controlled the Mediterranean, but they were originally based in Tyre, Sidon, which is just north of Israel, kind of where modern day Lebanon, Syria would be. That's where their language sort of originated. But it sort of, since they interacted with the Greeks and the Latins, in other words, their language was a little bit more of sort of more similar to our Dutch now, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And
like
but
guttural,
but some of the letters shared with Hebrew and things like that. And then now they found also some Hebrew writings on the Americas, but and just basic things that are contained in the Book of Mormon. So Tucker Carlson had said like maybe he shouldn't be. He'd always sort of discounted and sort of laughed at the Book of Mormon as pure fictional myth, and now he's more willing and open to exploring it as something to help understand at least some of the cultures.
Yeah.
So I think that was Eddie saw that thing and thought maybe he should, find out what's going on.
Yeah.
And so he took upon the challenge to read the first 5 chapters.
5 chapters and the introduction.
And the introduction.
So
let's have everybody here's the first year reaction and our questions to.
Sure.
Is it the introduction?
The introduction. So the introduction, for those of you who haven't read, by the way, for anytime we ever introduce any piece of literature at all, I highly recommend you go read it for yourself. Don't just take our word for it. I mean, we're definitely going to try to always be as forthcoming, straightforward, and truthful as we can every time we introduce anything. But that doesn't mean that you may
The book's better than the podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We'll see. So that is yet to be seen. No, but yeah, no, seriously. Always read it for yourself. Always get your own impressions. I mean, you can definitely take what we've said as like kind of maybe an angle in how to research it or how to study or where to go. But yeah, definitely don't always take our word for things, even though we will never try to steer you wrong deliberately. It may happen accidentally on occasion. So, my first impression is I think it's aliens. Now, and I say that semi humorously, and what I mean by that is, as I've looked at a lot of the ancient civilizations, Christianity, Judaism, even ancient Greek and Roman cultures, ancient Egyptian cultures, there's always this kind of this mesh between the natural and the supernatural, which is of course normal whenever you're speaking of the divine, right? And where those two worlds meet, the natural and the supernatural, the natural and the metaphysical. What's always been fascinating to me is I've always tried to look at it from 2 different points of view. In one point of view, I try to look at it from the point of view of the person who's truly faithful, truly devout, and like just takes everything that's in the faith-based text on faith, right? Like as someone who's really in that, so if I read a piece of Greek mythology, I try to read it as someone who like really believed in Greek mythology. But I also then read it again as someone who is like looking at this from a purely materialistic, like
anthropological,
right, with no eye toward believing in the supernatural and seeing kind of what I come up with. And one of the interesting things that comes up over and over and over again is it would be very difficult to distinguish gods from aliens. Very, very difficult. Not saying that you can't do it. There are definitely some aspects that the divine have that aliens probably can't emulate. But like, depending on how far out there you go, like for example, an alien from another dimension that's kind of like a 5th or 6th dimension that's kind of like looking down on us.
Before we get in the weeds too much, just compare. I have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old daughter.
Yep.
And right, so and there are tons of videos of this with parents doing certain magic tricks with their kids. I saw one today where the father, without his cutscene, filled his mouth with water.
Okay, yeah.
And then the mom took a water bottle with the lid off and stuck it against her head. And then dad started spitting water out, and the child starts what? It's just like amazing. That's amazing.
That's awesome.
And
it's like,
yes. But sleight of hand, even just other things, our ability to understand the natural world and do things are so much elevated from our children.
Yes.
Right? It's almost like a godlike status. They can't really understand how we do it. And we take it secondhand because we understand.
Right.
Right. Everything and then they learn to take it for granted. Okay, flipping the switch turns on the light, and so just the difference between our knowledge right? We believe, eventually God will give us all this knowledge and it will make sense to us. But
Right.
our difference between um, him and us right now is, we are the dust of the
Far
earth.
too vast, yeah.
Unobedient dust of the earth, and he, right? And that's the science fiction equality, right? That aliens would always, that interact with us, would always have higher levels of technology, understanding, intelligence, things like that, which God obviously has, right? That he deals with us on our level. So we also believe that they're God's children throughout the universe. We don't necessarily believe they're meant to interact with us,
right?
And that the scriptures, well, that Heavenly Father is the God of the universe; they're all His children. That the main purpose of the Book of Mormon is to help us understand Christ's role in our salvation and bring people into Him. But also, helps. It's also written for our day, and how the threats and the experiences of these ancient Americans are relevant to 21st century stuff. I think.
Now, when you say it's written for our day, is the author of the Book of Mormon Joseph Smith?
It would be Mormon,
or is it?
So we believe it's Mormon.
So it's kind of like in Mormon. So those for those who haven't got the background, Mormon's like way back in the day, right? So
Mormon lived about 400 A.D.
Right,
and so he was tasked with abridging all of the records of these people, which was about at that time about 1,000 years, of the people of the descendants of Lehi, and abridging down their story. And then he included in his abridgment a small record written by one of the early prophets, fathers called Nephi. Nephi was very revered because of his early stage.
Right.
That they were all kind of seen as descendants of him. And an abridgment included of another much earlier migration of people that came to America shortly after the Tower of Babel story in the Old Testament.
Amalekites or
no. Those are we call them the Jaredites, or the people of Jared. Right. Then the first migration happens, right, of Nephi and his family, shortly before Babylon conquers Israel, 600 years before Christ. Then there's a smaller migration of some people, we believe Phoenicians and some other people that left after, like as refugees in response to the Babylonian invasion.
Right.
Fled with Phoenicians, traders or whatever, and kind of escaped to the New World rather than sort of planning to come here or being in the same way.
Okay, so I want to go back to you said kind of written for our day.
Sure.
Does that mean that like Mormon wrote it, but that Joseph Smith kind of like modified it or adapted it for the modern?
But that's a good question. So Mormon and his son Moroni, who delivered the record to Joseph Smith, said that Mormon actually saw in vision, right, he was a prophet, our day, and saw what things would be most relevant for us to understand and know.
Right.
And so that we were to liken the scriptures unto us, like sort of put them in our setting, see the things how they would apply to us, and that there's things about the culture that are still in there, but a lot of it is things that he thought would be relevant for us today.
Okay.
So
he did kind of put his swag on it.
Well, yeah, because he's a bridger. Any abridger, right? Anybody who's any historian, like I'm reading Tom Holland's Dominion right now, and he's doing Christian history, 2,000 years of Christian history, and actually several hundred years of Western history in one volume. You're.
It's like we can tell the Lord of the Rings in 30 minutes.
You have to. Everybody's making decisions on what to keep in and what to leave out.
Right.
So that's an abridger is taking, but his stated purpose, at least what he said, for what he chose to leave in was the things that when people would read the Book of Mormon, i.e. in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, the things that that he left in the things that would be most relevant.
Okay. So the gold plates that Joseph Smith uncovers, they are the Book of Mormon. Like if someone were to look at the gold plates and like match it up to the Book of Mormon, it'd be like the Book of Mormon would be an abridged version of that.
No.
Or
the Book of Mormon is a translation.
Okay.
So then
So it's a direct translation.
Yeah, direct translation.
So
to
then,
the gift and power of God. So then he then translates Mormon's record into English using his language of the time. Right?
Okay.
Using the language that's available to Joseph Smith.
Okay.
Right.
I think I get it now.
Right.
Okay.
So that's why he would lean on. His family had the King James Bible.
Right.
And was very steeped on that. And so that type of language would felt more natural to him.
Right.
To express the things, the ideas that he's translating. So he uses a style and a language, English, that's very formal, like the King James Bible.
Right.
It's not exactly right, exactly the same, but that's sort of what he was comfortable with, what it was sort of his language at the time.
Right. So yeah, one of the things that I noticed, and I think you and I talked about this once, was in the Bible, there's kind of like four like kind of primary genres of methodology, right? There's like the poetic genre, the law, history, and the prophets, right? And Joseph Smith kind of meshes some of those together. Is that for like brevity? Is that for like the narrative, like the storytelling?
It's how Mormon smashed them together.
Okay.
So really, it was the plates of Mormon, what we would call it, is sort of the history record with some prophecy put in there. And then he attached the plates of Nephi, which were really focusing just on religious things and not on historical stuff at the beginning.
Got it.
So up until the book of Jerem in the Book of Mormon, it's these plates of Nephi that are not really, the history was a secondary thing.
Got it.
Then starting with, and Mormon didn't really abridge those.
Okay.
He just sort of attached them, right? Then his abridgment starts with, there's a book in there called The Words of Mormon. And he talks about, God inspired me and told me for a wise purpose to put these plates of Nephi, these small plates of Nephi, to include them.
Right.
But now here begins my abridgment in the historical record, starting from this point. And so he does it. So then when there was, because obviously there was a true history and a religious history that he's abridging, and at relevant points he brings in the most relevant religious stuff.
Yeah, okay.
In a weave, and it's more, once you get to the Word of Mormon, it reads more like a historical record with some sermons in it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. It does. Okay. All right. So let's for the sake of the audience, why don't you briefly go over kind of like the plot line of the first 5 books then? And
right. So for a book that his interest is in how it explains some of the ancient American culture, it begins in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Right. So the setting is a prophet, a contemporary of Jeremiah, that the Lord, who is of, we find out later, and he's a Hebrew, but not of the tribe of Judah.
Right.
Had come to live in Jerusalem after the destruction of the 10 tribes, the tribe of Joseph. And that the Lord is now warning him again. His family had been warned to leave then, but now Jerusalem has become wicked and will be destroyed by the Babylonians.
And now let me just interject here. Is this like kind of like a Noah's Ark situation, like basically all of Jerusalem's wicked, or was he the only redeeming family?
Well, no, Jeremiah, right? So
right.
There were, and I think he talks about that there were other people who were trying to warn.
Okay.
Right, and Jeremiah stayed, and we have the Lamentations, and some other people stayed. Right, Ezekiel, right, were carried off and preserved the gospel, or preserved the faith
through Babylonian
and Babylonian occupation, right? Daniel and others. So there were some that just, especially the king, the kings of Judah had become corrupted.
Right.
And so God wasn't protecting them as a nation. Now they had
a common occurrence in the Bible.
the leaders had let them stray since Solomon, right? After Solomon, there were the two kings. The first king or the kingdom of the 10 tribes, Jezebel and Ahab, very famously corrupted much faster, were destroyed by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom was going that way until Josiah reawakened the faith, and then they had Hezekiah. They had a couple of kings that kept them closer, and so they were
stayed righteous, right?
But then with Zedekiah, they had fallen back into.
Now, from a skeptic's point of view,
sure, yeah.
It seemed when I was going through the Bible and like reading Kings and Judges and so forth, it almost seemed like it was in reverse. Like instead of saying they were unrighteous, and because they were unrighteous, these bad things happened, which is what they said. It often felt a lot more like they lost and these bad things happened, therefore they were unrighteous. Did you ever feel that? You ever get that sense that's bad stuff happens, and so you kind of like we do today in politics, where it's like Kamala may have had the best intentions, but man, all this bad stuff happens, so it's like out with the old, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and the apologists certainly that were writing from the Babylonian captivity that they talk about. Like a lot of the records in the Old Testament were preserved by scribes writing from Babylon, from the perspective, and so reflecting on why they lost to Babylon now when they were spared the Assyrian occupation, and their determination, right, was essentially statewide corruption.
Interesting,
right? That the kings, so essentially Israel as a nation, not as individuals,
right,
had fallen to a level of wickedness where the Lord would not protect them, right? And not that they had to be carried off by Babylon, but if Babylon chose to, he wasn't going to stop it.
See, I always get the sense that it's like that was the lens that they saw the world through, and understandably, because that's they didn't have like the accoutrement that we have today, the other lenses that we've developed over time, but it's almost like there weren't too many different options, right? It was like if bad things happened, there weren't too many conclusions to draw. The only other conclusion is like the conclusion that I would draw if you lost to Babylonia is that you didn't have enough troops, you didn't have sufficient supply lines, you didn't have good tactical, right? But like, I don't know if those things were even in the mind.
Babylon's army technology was
superior,
right? And that was really generally true even of the Assyrians of earlier occupations. If you want to get into the weeds a little bit, one of the telling scriptures, Isaiah is warning prior kings of Israel before Zedekiah, but he had said, "Associate yourselves, and you will break into pieces." And you might read that saying, "What does that mean?" Associate yourselves with, I was trying to say, is form alliances. And Israel was barred by the Lord from forming alliances.
Right.
He needed to protect them. It's sort of like Gideon. It's like you can't take that huge army into battle, or they'll just think you won it because your arms were strong.
Right.
You have to have your small army so that they know you were delivered by the Lord.
Right.
And he said, don't make political alliances. Let the Lord defend you. Well, Zedekiah started getting freaked out and thought, oh, well, the way I can protect against the new rising power, which is Babylon, is to align myself with the Egyptians.
Right.
They'll come to my aid. That actually provoked Babylon.
Right.
Babylon really didn't see Israel as something worth their trouble until all of a sudden they're aligned with the Egyptians, right? And so the prophets trying to give, generally the prophets that are recorded in the Bible were the ones that were directly given advice to the kings.
Right.
Right. And Elijah, that was their ministering responsibility.
Right.
Isaiah especially. Lehi, we believe his ministering was not to the kings but to the people,
right?
And trying to raise general righteousness and repentance.
So it's almost like God knew best.
Yes, and so, but that Zedekiah did not want to follow those directions. Wanted to use politics,
right,
to solve his problems rather than becoming more faithful. This is the lens that very much was seen the writers on Babylon looking back on it. That Zedekiah
Gotcha.
had erred and led Israel down a wicked path.
Yep.
Of disobedience and thus, and so when they reach essentially a point of no return, like even if people repent at this time,
yeah,
they're going to be righteous individuals living in Babylon.
Right. Babylon's already noticed.
We've reached a level where institutionally Israel is not going to continue to be autonomously living in Jerusalem.
Right.
So God warns Lehi, he's the first prophet there, to take his family and leave.
Right.
He hasn't told them where, but just leave the city.
Right. Get out of Dodge.
So the first 5 chapters talk about where he takes his family out in the desert, and he was a wealthy man, lived in the city, had a great household, but he comes out and he lives in a tent with his wife and his sons, Nephi, Laman, or the oldest Laman, then Lemuel, his third son Nephi, and his younger son Sam.
Yeah.
And then once they're out in the desert, the Lord tells them, before you leave, it's important that you get what he called the brass plates.
Right.
And this is a record that his family had that was sort of the Bible up to that point, where it had the Torah and some history and some of the prophets, some of the Psalms, right? A pre-Babylonian Old Testament, we say, but also a record of his genealogy, things like that, and the language, the written Hebrew.
Right.
And said he wanted him to do that and bring that with him to sort of preserve their culture. And so he sends his sons back to sort of the patriarch of the family, a warlord named Laban,
right,
to appeal to him and says, Laban, can we have these brass plates? You don't care about them. Laban was not a religious person. So they're mostly religious. Can we have them? And Laban said no. Okay. So you want to tell the story of Laban and your reaction?
Yeah, sure. So so basically Laban, they go to Laban. They ask nicely. He says no. They go back, and they're like, well, we got to figure out something. And throughout this whole situation, Nephi's kept the faith. Right, he's like this really devout. He believes in and he studied the history of the Bible, so he knows that in the past, God has done incredible things with incredible people. Moses is able to split the Red Sea. So he's like, all right, this guy's only got 50 household guard. If Moses can bring Israel to freedom, through against thousands and thousands, we've got to be able to handle this one guy. So, the first they try to bribe him. First they try to say, or to say, like, listen, to purchase it, right? So they go back and they say, well, we were rich. We're leaving. We've got all this wealth. We've got this land, this property. You can have it all. All we want are these like little brass plates. And the guy says no again. And at this point,
and he takes their stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And he's at this point, he's like, yeah. Thanks for bringing all this stuff. Yeah. And still no, right? And so they go back, and at this point, Nephi, he's a vision, right? He's told that he's gonna. That it's going to be delivered to him, that Laban is going to be delivered to him. And so he goes back in alone and stumbles on Laban drunk, and he finds him in his garb and his sword, and there's the sword, and he's wrestling with it. He's like, do I really need to kill him? And eventually he takes his life. And puts on his clothes, his garb, his armor, and everything, so that he looks like Laban, and then goes and finds Laban's assistant, his advisor.
Sort of. I would say like his equivalent to Batman's.
Like a steward, right? Like a steward, right? Like his right hand guy is runner of his business,
runner of his estate,
right? And and the guy thinks he's Laban because he looks like Laban. He's got Laban's clothes on, his armor, his sword, everything. And so he convinces his steward to give him the plates finally, and they leave the city. And even his brothers are in awe and think that he is actually Laban because he looks like him, and he has to call out and says, no, it's me. And they realize that's who it is, and they're able to leave the town. Now, the reason that they end up killing Laban is because, I guess it's decided that if they don't, Laban will take his 50 household guard, or maybe even arouse others, and chase them down, hunt them down, and kill them.
The greater loss of life.
But I wrestled with this one, and I talked to Christian about it. This one has been tough for me, and it happens in the Bible time and time again. Where you see like Abraham is called upon to sacrifice his son, and like just so many times where God is basically testing obedience, and there's this kind of like tension between obedience right away because God's saying to do this right now, versus like this kind of general obedience to God's law, which is just kind of universal and always there, right? Because we know that thou shalt not kill, and that's a law that's been there since the Ten Commandments. So I always wonder, like, how could you make that?
We shouldn't murder.
Could you make that call? Like, if someone appears to you, and let me put it this way: if I saw a vision, and I believed it to be a real vision, a true vision, like I could distinguish it from like a hallucination, and someone's telling me to kill someone else, my first thought is that's a devil, that's a demon, that's someone who is trying to deceive me. So how do you even distinguish between a good vision, a bad vision, between doing right and wrong, doing, what, I mean, everything becomes right if God says it, because that's definitionally the case. But like, how do you, could you do it?
Right. So I think that's the great test of our spirituality.
Yeah.
Our when we talk about people who are spiritual giants and people who are great, is the ability to distinguish between good spirits and bad spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Follow the Spirit, to be sensitive to the Spirit, right? To live your life in such a way that you get a greater endowment of clarity. Like Nephi had created this, had acted in a lot of faith, and more than once, 3 times, and sort of passed God's test. And then he received a greater sort of witness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the witness, right, when it comes from God, the witness is too, when it comes to breaking a commandment, we know it's rare that it usually comes from a place of compassion. God loves his children. God loved Laban.
Yes.
And to us, a death seems as a final judgment.
Yeah.
For God, it doesn't. Right? That spirit in Laban still lives. He stops Laban from committing further sin.
Mm-hmm.
He sees the future, what would happen to Laban in a Babylonian occupation, and sees the greater benefit for the family, for this family that he is going to bring to America, to have the gospel, have a record of the gospel.
Right.
Because not even enough to have an oral tradition, but have a written record that they can turn back to, so that it doesn't become corrupted. And that if they go through periods of time like Israel went with, where there wasn't a prophet, but they could go back to the written record, to the scriptures,
right,
to help guide them until the prophet was there to lead them.
Is the contention in the Mormon faith that the record that proceeded throughout the Babylonian occupation, that one became corrupted? Is that the...
No, we believe the Bible to be the Word of God.
Okay.
Right. No, it's not that it was corrupted. There are things missing.
Okay.
Right. Everybody talks about there are missing books in the Bible. Right. There are things that were lost.
Right.
And
most of the ones that are missing because someone decreed them to be missing, rather than like, oops, I lost my keys. It's not like, wait, where did my books of Bible go? No, it was like, it's here, but it's like, no, we don't like this one.
it might be, right. And there are different ones. Now, there are a couple of prophets that are quoted by Nephi in the books of Nephi, that he's like, oh, everybody knows this guy.
Right.
Because he quotes Isaiah, and you're like, oh yeah, because when he's talking about Christ, he says Isaiah prophesied these great things about Christ. Mm. You're like, yeah. And there was this other prophet who also Zenos, who had these great prophecies. Everybody knows Zenos. We're like,
we're like,
and it's other Zenock, and you're like, no. And like the book of Jasher is kind of mentioned. There are lots of books sort of in if you Google, anybody can Google lost books of the Bible. There are books that are referenced in the Bible that we've lost their record.
Right.
Which is why it's so interesting when people get some of the new discoveries like Dead Sea Scrolls and other scrolls that have been discovered late 19th century, especially their date, as they translate them. There was one, they're still in the process of studying it, but they think it might be an Old Testament that predates the Babylonian occupation, right? That and to see the differences and see some things that were missing, and what the Catholic Church includes what they call the Apocrypha,
right?
And that there is some value in there, and that but we don't treat it. Well, why it's not part of canon is because the authorship, the time is, and what is left in. We can't really rely on it fully, but there's some value there, especially understanding. Catholics give more value to it. We've at this point decided to say designated as potentially valuable apocrypha, but
fascinating.
But since the authorship is not potentially corrupted.
It's interesting. Yeah, I read it. So I was reading some of the books from like Tobit or the books that are like they're in the Catholic Bible, they're not in the King James version. And I some of them I'm like I read them and I go to my brother, I'm like, why is this like being fought over? Like there's really nothing here. I mean, many of them are like just another version of obey God or like or you're gonna have trouble. But like I mean, I guess some of them have like these like very minor. Like I could see some of them like where like sola scriptura is kind of challenged, or like not really, but like that like some concepts are like very modestly brushed up against, and I could see why like the Baptist wouldn't want it, but it really isn't that bad. I didn't think it was, I didn't think it was big enough to worry about, but
generally, it's considered the books, at least the King James compilation, were the ones that were least argued about or had the most consensus about their authorship.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Even the Song of Solomon, as we believe, right, and was not a Old Testament record. Was written in the 1st century. Right. And we don't believe it to be of prophetic origin. It's just a nice poem allegory about God.
It's easy to prophesize stuff after the fact.
But they put it in there because next to the actual words of Psalm, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes in there just because of its name. But it's not really, Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, was written over 400 years before Christ.
Right.
It doesn't really fit in chronologically there. But those are decisions that scholars made, right? Right. And they're men, and we don't feel like they were perfect, but they did a very good job. So even though they're Joseph Smith, we have a version that's sort of correcting some versions of some mistakes in the Bible, or have a certain way that we see things. We still use the King James because it's the least politically. It's so old. It's sort of like neutral territory.
Yeah.
It's not politically slanted.
It's kind of
generally
like
towards one way.
The bulk of the Protestant faith will at least So to finish it up, I guess the last little bit is they come back and of course many of them were real thrilled about leaving all of their wealth in the beginning and venturing off into the wilderness, but the mother in particular is kind of distraught. But she finds her faith after they all come back, which is great.
All of her sons come back.
Yeah, now it's all better.
Successfully, she's like, "Oh, Lehi."
And then Nephi is, I guess, kind of brought into like the greater witness territory at that point because he's now that's great, but is there any evidence to corroborate?
All right. So there are as we read on follow. So this first camp that they camp at, and then they camp down in another place,
right?
And then where they have traced basically along the Red Sea a route that today matches similar places.
What they would have,
what they would have experienced in Arabia, at least, right? So the first Nephi sort of places while they're still in the old world, all sort of correlate.
Got it.
But people say, well, just looked at that.
Well, so right. You can piece it together if you had enough knowledge. But in 1830, it's harder.
I know, it's harder. But right, so and we know Jerusalem existed. So everything that's talked about so far is not really architecturally contested so much. Right. It's not until they get to America.
Yeah, the tough part
is it starts getting spicy.
Right.
But for now, but it is. You've never heard the things that that old world, especially like where we say the oldest faith, dating back to Adam and Abraham, the Abrahamic faith, Abrahamic law, covenant, was a gospel was known here in the Americas before.
Had not heard
before
that.
Columbus.
Had not heard that at all. Now, one thing I will say, and again, this is kind of like even from the skeptics like mind frame. One thing that I've learned as I've like looked over these ancient cultures, like these ancient civilizations, is that when you're in the ancient culture and it takes so long to like carve things into stone, to carve things into brass, to carve things into gold, it takes so long. Like,
and you don't have infinite supplies of gold. You have to be, it's precious.
I didn't even like writing a 500-word essay in English with a pencil, and paper, where I could erase it whenever I messed up, where I could, literally so much was going my way and I hated it. And it still took me days, to do those homework assignments, right? And like, you're talking about stuff that would take people like months of their lives to complete. I just don't see too many people doing that unless there's something to it. Like, I doubt they're writing a fiction on these giant stone tablets. I doubt they're writing a fiction on these brass plates. So, like, these days, like I've said it to you, I've said I would be willing to bet, like, even the Greek gods, who I thought were, like, this my whole life I grew up like thinking, these Greeks are lunatics to have believed in they're probably real people who like were given this kind of like divine status, even though they weren't really, gods, right? Like probably like maybe a god, did teach them some agriculture. And so it's like, now it's the god of agriculture, right? Maybe a god, did kind of like, run the ferry system in the Nile. And that's, I mean, maybe. I don't know where all these stories necessarily, trace their origin. But so the one thing I will say in favor of these plates is that like you would have spent so much time to make up a false narrative that it almost defeats the point, right? Like, but by the same token, I'd love to get a hold of those plates. Like, I'd love to be able to see them, touch them, like Doubting Thomas, and run my hands over the plates, and like, well, and have people come in and say, yes, we can date these marks or whatever back to da 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 da. I don't know if that's possible with gold or with
the carbonate gold. We believe now it was a gold alloy,
right? Electrum, maybe, or
because or something that the primitives have that would have been a little bit more portable, but also a little bit. Gold can be softer, kind of thing. But as far as a scribely cast was something usually reserved for the wealthy. Right? The very first verse of the Book of Mormon does what as Nephi, he describes his family. He says, I'm Nephi, he introduced himself, being born of goodly parents.
Right.
Now, goodly doesn't mean I had good parents.
Yeah,
who loved me.
I love them.
Nobody would say that. Like nobody in the ancient world would say that. Would say that something that insipid.
Right.
They would be like, no, my parents were wealthy.
Yeah.
Right. It says right at the beginning, and because of that wealth, I was educated.
Right.
Right. And when few people were, and so then since so few people have,
what kind of percentage are we talking? Do you think? Probably like 10%, right?
So the Hebrews had a much higher level of literacy than almost any other culture.
True, because they had.
But as far as writing, I mean, the people that read and write, I would still say if it's about 50%,
that'd be doing.
That would be, but for the ancient world, I would say non-Hebrew, it was probably closer to 5%.
Yeah, right.
And really like the upper class that could afford wealthy countries can afford to support them because as a writer, right, you're being paid for your mind, do something, intellectual. You're not killing animals or raising food. You're not producing that. So you need other people to support your way of life, kind of thing.
Essentially, yeah.
And so they sort of designated, all right, we can have this many scribes, but really we need most people to either be defending us from
growing
armies
livestock,
or growing livestock, or building wells or whatever. So that's really the expansion of our present day leisure class.
Yeah.
Cannot be transposed in any way.
You guys don't know how good you've got it.
Yeah. But he was one of the elite, so he would have known, and would have taken that responsibility seriously. Like you're one of not everybody gets a chance to do this.
Right.
You get to be the ones who can spend the time to write and read. And I don't think his brothers did. And you have 4 sons, it's kind of like not all your sons are going to be interested in that.
Right.
Which is why it would usually be the purview of the oldest son.
Right.
To become the record keeper.
Ah, okay.
Right? Like ideally layman.
Makes sense.
Right, would have, right, you're saying but if he's not interested in that, he
right.
wants to maybe run business, make money, or do whatever, run other things, and not interested in the spiritual matters of the record keeping, then it would, or the second son was, I'm not interested in either, then it would fall to the third son.
Right.
It's definitely a type of thing where those who have the spiritual capacity and interest and intelligence to do it.
And the other brothers did not seem to have the spiritual capacity.
There's a lot of theories on that, but they were asked to do hard things.
Right.
Right. And what we have a lot of times in the scriptures is just especially like the book of Judges, of just people, all I do is win, and leaving out the kind of guys who struggled in their faith.
Right.
Right. Where at least in Moses, like the story of when they explored the land of Canaan, that other than Caleb and Joshua, everybody comes back and they're scared. Yeah. They're like, whoa, right. Oh my gosh, this is going to be,
those dudes are huge.
It's rare that you get that kind of record, normally it's just the winners, and
those cities have walls.
But people they get asked to do something, they're like, nope, I'm out. That's too much for me. And that's Lemon and Lemuel were kind of like, yeah, are you serious? Oh, our younger brother's doing it. Okay. Yeah. But everybody has different faith. But ultimately, Leah is trying to keep his family together. He wants his sons to have that, and as long as he's alive, they sort of keep that together.
Got it.
What you find is once he passes, that the older brothers are not interested in being essentially following their younger brother, who, being the spiritual leader, would essentially take over the role.
Right. No, of course not. Yeah. No. Right. Why would they want that?
That's why their families separate. Yeah. They, almost immediately after they had.
So as far as evidence goes, I mean, you've still got the plates, presumably somewhere, but just no one can see them.
No, well, the plates were taken up into heaven.
They were?
Yeah.
So they're not in a church somewhere?
No.
Oh, okay. No. So they're not even available for...
They're not on the earth.
Okay. Wow. I didn't even know that. All right.
Yeah.
And what about, the sword? Also taken? The stones? Or some of the stuff. And you don't need... Quick shortcut for those of you who don't know, there are parts of the Mormon faith that are basically undisclosable to the uninitiated. So I don't know what is and what isn't. So if I hit something,
as far as what we know, is that the golden plates themselves, which had a material sort of value and were not safe to be on the earth and were taken off the earth after the translation.
Yeah, I mean there were a lot of people trying to.
Because it wasn't safe for the church. They had to move. That's why they ended up in Utah, because everywhere they tried to settle, we can get into Mormon history in another episode.
Yeah,
but they everywhere they tried to settle, they faced violence.
Now, from a skeptic's point of view, that would be like a head scratcher, right? That would be like, okay, so it's like, all right, this is evidence that could be available, and it's like, oh, it's been taken into heaven. I'm like,
it's true, yeah.
And then I'm trying to think of reasons to do it, right? So let's say, one reason is that someone might get it and melt it down. Okay, no, but it being in heaven really doesn't, it being melted down is effectively the same thing, right? Like it's gone.
I guess that's true.
Or like the worst case scenario would be they're basically not real, and someone gets them and shows people that they're not real. But like, then it wouldn't need, then the only reason to take it to heaven would be to hide it, which would be kind of weird, right?
So the reason there's a portion of the plates that's not were sealed. We're not translated.
Oh, okay.
Joseph Smith was only allowed to translate.
So that part needs to be protected.
That part is kind of a little more easy to understand, but is a vision given to John the Beloved. It was John the Beloved's calling to write it. It was also shown to.
But did Joseph see it, or he didn't? He sealed that away even from him. Wow.
He wasn't able to read it or translate it at all. It was given to the same vision that knowledge was had of a prophet here in the Americas, and he wrote it. It was sealed up on the plates, and that we believe, right? What we're told is it will be revealed. That we will have if we can appreciate the Book of Mormon enough, read what we've got, then the Lord will give us more.
Got it.
Right? We'll reveal more.
Take us into it. Is it like a third covenant, like a perfected version of it, or
no? But it's essentially right. Mm-hmm. If you have faith in the Book of Mormon, then it expounds on that greater. If you still don't believe the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, you'll discount it. But
you won't be ready.
It will give clear preparations for Christ's second coming and for the millennium.
Okay.
And but you would only follow them or abide by them if you already believe the Book of Mormon is true. Like the Book of Mormon is supposed to bring Jew and Gentile to Christ.
Right.
Help as a record. We call it the Stick of Joseph, as a record of the tribe of Joseph here in America, which was a promised land, to stand with the Bible, a record of God's dealings with the tribe of Judah in ancient Israel, in the Old World. And those two together form a second witness, right? In the Old Testament, no truth could be established just by one witness. Got it. Right? Then it's just your word against mine. Right. Any truth had to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses.
Makes sense.
And the thing is, right, of Christ, there are a lot of religions that just appear in one place. Right. Have one appearance. Right. And so Christ is really the God of the whole world. Another record, another appearance of him to a separate people validates that he's the true God of the whole world. And that's the case of the Book of Mormon, is that he's not just another Mesopotamian or Middle Eastern deity, because he also appeared
even though
independently.
He had Mesopotamian roots still, even
though. They knew they had the preparatory, right? The law of Moses is to prepare people for Christ. Got it. So Christ came. So,
but then because he can appear across across the world.
Right. John 10 is other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must go into, and there will be one fold and one shepherd. Right. We believe that was Christ telling the people there that yes, they were his people, but there were other sheep, right, descendants of the house of Israel, because he was sent only to the house of Israel. Right. They needed to know that his mission had been prophesied. Makes sense. They had a right in their covenant to know that it had been fulfilled. And so him coming to America was a fulfillment of that covenant. Right. Right. Not every people here in America, right, you talked about the lines coming over from the Bering Strait and things like that, had that. Only those who had the Hebraic covenants were entitled to Christ's witness. But by having another witness of Christ, it backs up the Bible. Very true. Right, as saying independently on 2 continents, we weren't sharing information.
Without any any travel.
And not pre-Columbian. Yep. And so that's his ultimate
at least
goal.
That we know of.
Right. And so at least that we know of. But that's we'll get to that more. But interesting idea.
So,
are you ready to?
I got one more idea to pitch to you. Yeah. Right. So here's the aliens idea. Sure. Right. Now, suppose one of the things I've done recently is like I've noted how similar some religions are to like like one thing that it's funny that atheists kind of brought it up recently in recent times, called simulation theory. Are you familiar with this?
No.
It's basically the concept that, like the Matrix, like we're all in a simulation, and there's a programmer programmed this virtual reality. But the funny thing is, like, the more I think about it, I'm like, well, that's perfectly compatible with Christianity, because if you assume God to be the programmer and he's got this program, well, he can access any point in the program at any point in time. So he's literally omniscient. He can be at any point, he can modify any point of the program at any point in time. He's omnipotent. Yeah. He's the one that directs the flow of the program. So he's good, right? So it's like literally like every aspect of simulation. The only thing that's questionable is
the user and one of the programs.
Right. The only thing that's questionable would be like whether or not there's more than one programmer. That would be the only thing that would keep Christianity from being simulation theory, right? Like, but the other thing is, like, if you think about it, like, let's say there was an alien species that is like at a higher dimension, right? That sees us in 3 dimensions the way that we would see words on a paper in 2 dimensions, right? Like, he can see all of it at the same time, right? Like words on a page. And
they don't see us. They
don't see us, right? Like the words on the page don't have that kind of awareness, but it's a higher dimension, right? And so then you've got these plates, which are, by the way, gold and brass plates, like carving words into them. You can't carve that many words into a brass plate. So we're either talking about overwhelming numbers of plates, or like a very condensed form of the language, which was
they call a modified Egyptian. A reformed Egyptian is what he talks about.
So like almost like one sentence to a symbol.
I don't know. Again, I don't know, but yeah, but writing and I can show you some things, some ancient writing, even ancient places have where they write it very small and they can cram a lot onto a short area. So space was at a premium. What they put down there was stuff that they had probably written drafts of before, and were sure that this was the important stuff to record for history or for other things.
Or it was technological in nature, and it was data compressed, and then thousands of years later, Joseph Smith gets these stones that decompress the zip file, right? Because he's I know I'm being semi-facetious, but like it's interesting that
gold plates were
it would be difficult to tell the difference, though, right? Like, if that were the case,
it would be so beyond his ability to understand,
right?
And he would need an angel,
and moreover,
to reveal the technology to him.
Moreover, would it make any difference? Like, if there's this 6th dimensional being that does have all those powers, that essentially is God to us. I mean,
and how God chooses to relate his thing to you, you're not going to understand it,
right?
Even if it at some point it might be like as perfectly make as perfect sense as a binary, language and electric switches or whatever. But at that point, really at our point, his level so much above us, it's just easier to sort of let him know that, all right, we're using it. This is a medium for me to communicate.
So anyway, I just thought that was a fun little take, a little spicy take.
Yeah, what do you think of the spicy take? Urim Thummim as a hard drive reader.
That's it. They're like they're like data decompression. Yeah, right. Anyway, what do you guys think? Put your comments below, and we'll catch you next time on Common Mansplaining.